It is often debated whether Mennonites are a cultural group or a religious one. The answer is, they are kind of both. Mennonites were originally a group that separated from the Roman Catholic Church in the 16th century, linking them to an Anabaptist movement at the time. The main distinction of the Anabaptist movements, which literally means rebaptizers, was the belief that an individual should be baptized later in life when they confess to their faith voluntarily, instead of being baptized as a baby. An important figure in their history was a man named Mennonite. Perhaps you can see the connection already. He became influential in Anabaptist groups in the northern Germanic states, as well as the Netherlands, with the people that followed him being called Menists. No, not menaces. Menists. And were later called Mennonites. The Mennonites, even though they were directed by their faith to be pacifists, were persecuted for their beliefs, scattering across Europe and North America.
I think it was St. Catherine that invited the Mennonites over because of their farming skills.
And they invited the Mennonites from northern Germany to Russia?
Yes,
Okay.
they did.
Mm-hmm.
But they also promised that the Mennonites could have their own schools, their own churches, and that type of thing. And that, of course, and they did not have to go to war. Mm-hmm. Mennonites are pacifists.
Yes.
That's what makes them unique in their faith. Mm-hmm. And I'm afraid the Mennonites have really been persecuted. Like, if they didn't behave, they were sent to Siberia in Russia. The fathers were killed easily. For one thing, by being a pacifist, they really picked on the Mennonites because they knew the Mennonites wouldn't fight back.
This led to many seeking refuge in Canada, starting in the late 18th century.
And more settlers came in, and of course, because the Mennonites are going by faith, not by nationality. And their faith is Mennonite, so the first thing they do is set up a church.
They were pushed to Canada from a variety of factors, including the American Revolution, the Russification process that was being put in place by the Russian government, and conscription from both the world wars. During this time, most settled into small communities in southern Ontario, southern Manitoba, and westward. The Mennonites, like the try-hard farmers they were drawn in by the fertile land, as well as the promise of not having to participate in military service, as well as having cultural and educational independency. With them, they brought along their beliefs of Christianity and pacifism, as well as the German language. In the modern day, Canada has a population of well over 200,000 Mennonites, with more than half of that population living in urban cities. The largest concentrations are in cities such as Winnipeg, Vancouver, Saskatoon, and Kitchener-Waterloo, each being sustained by smaller rural communities. So, you might be thinking, 200,000. That's quite a lot of people. What have they contributed to Canada? How has their way of thinking, their values, their culture, affected how we live today? Well, even with Mennonites being a minority in respect to the larger population, they have still provided a lot throughout history. The Mennonite values of helping those in need, as well as maintaining a strong sense of union, are seen in communities today, as well as events past and present. When the Mennonite people came over from Europe, they brought more than just hearty food and a charming sense of fashion. Unlike the Amish, who were a separate group of Anabaptists that were more closed off in both their teachings and communities, the Mennonites are more open with spreading Jesus' teachings and providing services to other people. This is often to the sick, the unfortunate, and to refugees. Many organizations that focus on health and humanitarianism are owned or sponsored by Mennonite communities, as well as providing services to the general public. Along with this, a large number of Mennonites spend time away from home, doing missionary work, or volunteering for those in need. For a group that has been violently chased all over Europe, from Germany to the Netherlands to Switzerland to Poland to Russia to America, then finally to Canada, it's fitting that the Mennonites are willing to return the favor. No, not in the fiery persecution sort of way, but in the way of helping people that are going through the same situation. In 1979, the Mennonite Central Committee played a large part in helping Vietnamese refugees, establishing a program to help sponsor them. Another example, when Canada let in 25,000 refugees from the war that was happening in Syria, which is still kind of happening to this day, many Mennonite communities again stepped up with sponsorships.
As much as I know, and you could research that under the MCC, but they have people in both Palestine and in Israel, and they are constantly peacemaking and trying to get people to learn to live together and that type of stuff.
Due to their religion, many Mennonites attempt to avoid violence at all costs, instead vouching for providing services to the church and the people back at home during conflict. Sadly, their pacifism was actually one of the reasons they were expelled from many other countries, along with their religion. Their refusal to partake in war tended to upset governments, meaning many Mennonites had to move around to find a place that would accept them. As stated before, one of the promises made to the Mennonites when they were migrating to Canada was their exemption from military service. This was done because at the time, Canada had wanted people that were hard-working farmers, so the fertile land could be put to use. That, as well as people that were more or less aligned with the European-dominated government.
Church and work and family, of course, celebrating the Christian holidays.
During the First World War, as you should guess, the Mennonites did not contribute any soldiers to the front lines, instead donating money to organizations like the Red Cross, as well as contributing to services back at home. Throughout that time period, many different Mennonite churches across Canada came together to form
the Conference of Historic Peace Churches,
or the CHPC, which gave them more power to negotiate with the government. Groups were put together to send out to build roads, plant trees, fight forest fires, and cut down trees when there were fuel shortages. Eventually, this mass deployment of Mennonites as labor workers was cut back, explained here by this quote from Harder Gissing, a historian from the University of Waterloo. Some of them had been taken away from farm work, which seemed really counterintuitive. That kind of shifted in 1943, when the government finally realized we can't have thousands of men out there in the camps. They're needed in the farms and out in industry. Men were often sent back to their home area, but they had to work in agriculture and certain industries. Interestingly enough, the sentiment had partially changed by the Second World War. Of the Mennonites that were called to serve Canada in some way, around 41% of them enlisted in the armed forces. This likely was from a rapidly changing environment, as well as the Mennonite community and population becoming a lot more widespread. Now, I understand when I say Mennonites, you might think of a bunch of farmers living out in the country. Not much school, no having to worry about math, tests, or writing 3,000-word essays. Well, you would be wrong.
To begin with, the Mennonites came here because they were told they could have their own schools. And in their own schools, they simply taught writing and arithmetic and the Bible and the catechism. So that was what they had hoped to do here, but it didn't take very long, and the government stepped in and said, you need to teach these subjects, which of course would have been, language and history and English and science. And in those days you could quit school at 16, and so that's what most of them did, because their fathers figured it's time to go to work. Like I say, the work ethic was greatly valued.
As well as hosting a number of public schools, which are now run by the government, and private schools in their own communities, Mennonites actually run an entire university. Who would have thunk? The university itself is called the... Can you guess it? It's pretty hard. The Canadian Mennonite University. Who would have The university offers many degrees that are recognized internationally, including arts, social sciences, history, a little bit of sciences, and understandably a heavy degree of theology and church ministries. As a Christian university, it tries to teach modern knowledge within a framework of religion and faith. The Canadian Mennonite University, or CMU for short, also has a variety of programs and projects that aim to help with social and environmental issues. In its own words, they are committed to producing global citizens, individuals who continue to use their lives to learn, as well as strive in their career and volunteer work. With the belief of spreading the teachings of Jesus Christ, many organizations and charities have been formed under Mennonite communities or Mennonite leadership. These range in their reach and purposes, but all serve a common goal of helping people who are less fortunate. One you might have heard of is the Mennonite Central Committee, or MCC.
It started in 1927 when the Mennonites were being persecuted in the Ukraine, and a man by the name of D.H. Clausen, he went down there and he saw how the people were starving. So he came to Ohio, Akron, Pennsylvania, and he started soliciting the Mennonite churches all over the states and everywhere for money to buy grain and to feed them. So in the end, he had collected $2 million and with that he bought food and shipped it over to the Ukraine, and it was dealt not only to Mennonites but also to the Ukrainian, anybody who was starving.
Wow.
So that's how the MCC started.
Mm-hmm.
The stores only came in 1972.
It is one of the largest Mennonite non-profits in Canada, aiming to share the compassion of God through relief and development services. MCC spread to Canada in the year 1963 and hosts a number of Mennonite relief sales, with 78.2% of the funds being spread worldwide and the leftover goods being donated. Around 45 of these sales are held across North America and raise an average of $8 million every year. That's enough for 8 university textbooks. These sales feature handcrafted items, homemade food, and social programs usually overseen by Mennonite and Amish volunteers. Otherwise, MCC hosts a large number of thrift stores across Canada, as well as assists in longer-term care of natural, social, or political issues.
Yes. With that is MDS, and people will sign up and they will go to different areas, mainly the United States. Sometimes it's been Canada, to help rebuild the tornado-stricken communities.
The Mennonite Disaster Service Canada is more focused on the survivors of natural disasters. This is done by recruiting and organizing volunteers that help in any way they can to lessen the impact of accidents. The institution follows the Mennonite views of peace and giving service to others, following in the ways of Jesus Christ.
There is also the blanket making. And these blankets are being shipped overseas or also to the disaster areas. It's one of the fundamental needs in a disaster area. And so any fabrics that are kind of unused and not wanted anymore, they are used for blanket making. We here in Altona, I think about 6 times a year, they'll make, in 2 days, they'll make about 100 blankets.
Originally called the Mennonite Foundation of Canada, Abundance Canada was created in the early 1970s, when Mennonite leaders wanted to create an organization that would follow their beliefs. one which would make charity and giving easier to access. The group advocates for sharing financial resources with the less fortunate, as well as investing in ways which show social responsibility.
And then, of course, there's the World Organization, the food banks. Farmers will set aside a certain portion of their land and grow a crop. And then when it comes time for harvesting, they'll call all their neighbors. And you will see 10, 12, maybe more combines, big, monstrous combines lined up. And they go along this field, and in one sweep, they manage to combine it. It's quite impressive. And then, of course, that grain is shipped to countries that need it. And they have a hard time getting it to the poor people sometimes. Sometimes the rich rulers want it. Sometimes bandits want it. But they keep persevering.
Alright, you get the idea. Even with their history of being violently evicted from other countries, partially due to them being stubborn sons of and refusing to use violence, Mennonites held on to their core values of pacifism, community, and giving, farming much of the land up till the modern day, providing services during crises, and using their belief to spread aid and kindness. So, the next time you see a snazzily dressed Mennonite walking down the road, don't just see them as some cranky old farmer. I mean, there might be that, but still. Know that Mennonites are responsible for organizing charities, spreading positive values, and are even smart enough to have their own university. That makes them intellectual, right? As well as investing in ways which show social. That is the fourth time I've said social instead of social. In 1979, the Mennonite Central Committee played a large part, not just large part. One thing to note. One which would make charity and giving. Giving? What?
So that is why when we say that we are blessed, we are also given a mandate. That's the Mennonite way. Yeah. We are given a mandate to help the others.